All right, now we're going to deal with the comments on Mark chapter 8, verse 27 through chapter 9, verse 1. I want to remind you to go to the graded reader, and as you go through that and as you translate it and as you work on your exegesis, be sure to note the comments that Dr. Mounts makes. He does some very helpful things there. So you will want to call uh, that to your mind as you think about these things. Now, what I want to do here is just give you some brief comments, and you're welcome to use them any way you want to. The setting of this passage is, of course, at Caesarea Philippi, which was north of the Sea of Galilee, a good ways out of the area where Jesus usually did his ministry. He'd been traveling around the Sea of Galilee looking for some privacy so that he could give his disciples some special training. Jesus is asking a question here about what people think of him. The response to him had been varied. The Jewish leaders, of course, had rejected him already, were showing signs of that, and the common people, of course, heard him gladly, but a lot of people had a lot of different ideas. Jesus was trying to communicate who he was as Messiah, and his concept of Messiah, and that he was trying to get that, of course, across to his disciples because they were the ones that were going to have to communicate that. So after asking Jesus what the people thought of him, and they answered in a lot of different ways, he then personalized the question by asking them, "But who do you say that I am?" And as you know, Peter was the spokesman. He is the one who said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so Jesus called Peter blessed and told him that this answer did not come from man, but came from heaven. And certainly Jesus understood that there was the beginning of an understanding about his messiahship. And his response about the church indicates that. Jesus used the word church here and in Matthew 18:17, and the only places that he used it. The question comes up, did he intend to establish a church? And of course, while we can't go into this extensively and deal with that issue, we can at least make a few comments about it. And that is, we can certainly see, I think, when we look at it, particularly from this side, that his work among the disciples, the sending of the Holy Spirit, and of course his death and resurrection, all point to the fact that he was intending to call out some people to do the work that he had started and that he intended them to do. And so, whether we want, certainly his concept of church may not have been like ours. He certainly didn't think of a church as a building or a place or a thing, but he saw it as the people that he called out. But it is certainly clear that he was establishing this movement that would make it possible for the gospel to be proclaimed to the very ends of the earth. Jesus called Peter a rock here. Some confusion about this. What we need to note is that he used two different words here, two different forms of the word, Greek word for rock. The word Petros is what he used for Peter's name. You are Peter, you are Petros. And then the other word that he used is Petra, which is Petros is the individual rock, at least refers to that, and the Petra may refer to the larger bedrock, and it is on that bedrock that he is building the church. I think the conclusions that we can make about this. First of all, Jesus certainly did not build his church on any human, but he is the foundation. He is the only foundation. The New Testament makes that clear. Whatever our decision is about the language used here, it's important to note that Peter, as the spokesman for the disciples, certainly proclaimed a truth that needed to be proclaimed to show the reality here. Second thing needs to be said, we don't have to minimize the role of Peter. At the same time, we can certainly recognize that Peter did not assume the role that others in the history of Christianity have attributed to him, but he certainly was a leader among the disciples, so we certainly don't want to minimize his work. We need to see him as an important part of the church. He used his gifts, as did the other disciples, but Peter had a specific role to play. Jesus said in this, I'm building my church on this rock, and literally the gates of death will not prevail against it. The word that's used here is the word hadu, and it is a word that refers to Hades, the place of the dead. And so that's what he is speaking of here. While it is certainly true that Satan and hell cannot prevail against the church, what Jesus is talking about here is death. What death is he talking about? Is he talking about the death of those who are going to build the church? You know, even if you don't live forever, even if you die, the church will go on. Probably, maybe that's referred to, but probably he's referring more to his own death, and because that is certainly a part of the establishment of the church, and so he is making that, I think, very clear. The other thing that folks have trouble with here is the forgiveness statement. Whatever sins you forgive, they will have been forgiven. Whatever you retain, they will have been retained. I think if we could boil this down to its simplest understanding, which probably is the right one, that's the way it usually is, that Jesus is simply indicating that the church is to be the instrument of helping people understand how to receive his forgiveness. He's the only one who can forgive. And so the church participates in the proclamation of what God has already done in Jesus. And the responsibility of the church is to preach the gospel. And that's what Peter and the others were commissioned to do. And that, of course, applies to all of us as well. Jesus then moved on in verses 31 through 33 to talk about his death, and as he began to tell them that he must die. He would do that several times in the time that he had remaining, about 6 months or so, maybe a little bit more. But Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew where he was going. He knew that his suffering and death was going to occur in Jerusalem. And so he made that statement that he must go to Jerusalem and die. And of course, Peter, who had reacted so well just a few moments before, now messed it all up because he protested so strongly and rebuked Jesus for that, even though he had just confessed him as a Lord. He simply didn't understand the way of Jesus accomplishing his purpose and accomplishing his victory. Jesus also rebuked Peter very strongly. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." He'd called him a rock a little earlier, but now he calls him Satan. And the reason for the rebuke is that Peter was voicing the same temptation before Jesus that Satan had put before him as early as the wilderness. Peter wanted to see a physical victory that would please men. Jesus wanted to do the will of God. He knew the will of God included his death on the cross. And then in verse 34 through 9:1, this account, generally the same in all three of the synoptics. Mark says that Jesus spoke to the multitudes along with his disciples. Matthew says that he addressed the disciples. Luke's position could be between those. He says Jesus said to all. It's true that Jesus was alone with his disciples at the time of the confession by Peter, but the multitude was nearby, and they were always there to hear. It could well be that the multitude had already found him and was listening to his teaching. We know from other accounts that the multitude was constantly seeking Jesus wherever he went. So after the confession by Peter, Jesus started teaching the disciples in earnest that his Messiahship would not be a political messiahship. He was going to suffer. And if they followed him in the work which he had called him to do, they would also suffer. He knew that the cross was in his future. It was also in the future of his followers, in a very real sense. The man who valued his life more than he valued the life to which Jesus had called him could not be a real follower of Jesus. This means that there's no life for the follower of Jesus unless he's willing to be a servant in the ultimate degree. There's going to be a reward, there'll be joy and peace, but many times these things will come from the joy of knowing that life has been given in service of others. Service is done for the sake of Jesus, and Mark adds, for the gospel. The gospel is the good news about God's redemption in Jesus. So Mark's inclusion of this phrase is really another way of saying the same thing. When a life of service and a life of selfishness are compared, we can discover what the real value is. Our tendency is selfishness. His tendency is selflessness. And that, I think, is what he wants us to understand. So what do you have when life is over? Well, it's not the things that have come out of the selfishness that count. It is rather the things that have come out of giving up. What's the value of material things in the context of eternity? Certainly going to be a time when life is over. What then? Material values won't make that transition. Only spiritual values will, and that's what Jesus is trying to communicate. Jesus clearly connected the action of men with the coming of the judgment. Strong note of judgment here in these verses. The Son of Man is coming in glory. He'll repay those who served him in his name, and those who have failed to do so, he'll give them their just rewards. Those who will not be ashamed in his presence are those who have given their lives in his service. So, combination of Matthew 16:27, Mark 8:38, and Luke 9:26, with the verse that immediately follow each of those, causes some difficulty in interpretation. When is all of this going to happen? What is Jesus referring to? It seems to me that there is a general reference here, at the very least, that he is talking about the coming of his kingdom, the establishment of his kingdom. And we certainly see that in the events that took place in Jerusalem when he went to the cross, died for our sin, was buried, was raised from the dead, walked with the disciples and taught them for 40 days, then gave them instructions to remain in Jerusalem, ascended into heaven, and then the experience of Pentecost. When we put all of that together, we certainly see that that coming of the kingdom in a sense that means it's here, and that now our task is to participate in that kingdom. And of course that was brought about by the suffering and death of Jesus. And what he calls upon us to do is to participate in that and be citizens of the kingdom and to walk with him in that. All right, we'll see you back in our next assignment. Thank you.